All around me are familiar faces, worn out places, worn out faces.
In 1815, Mason Cogswell was a prominent New England physician. His daughter Alice was deaf, and they were the neighbors of Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, a young deaf student. Cogswell wanted his daughter to have a formal education and felt that Gallaudet would be a perfect candidate to seek and provide that for her. At this time, only private education was available and only located in Europe. He hired Gallaudet to work with the Baird family, who had a secretive oral program at the time. In his mission to find proper education, Gallaudet met two individuals from the Paris Asylum for the Deaf.
Laurent Clerc and Jean Massou founded the first free school for the deaf. The Catholic Church was founded by the Abbé Delille. Gallaudet returned to France with Clerc and convinced him to accompany him back to the United States, where they opened the American School for the Deaf in Connecticut in 1817. He hires deaf individuals as teachers and also formalized the use of sign language in the United States.
The year 1880 had a very large impact on deaf education in America. The Second International Congress met in Milan to discuss the education of deaf individuals and their educators. The conference was held purposely in Milan so that most deaf individuals could not afford to attend and voice their opinion on the education system. There were only 5 individuals in attendance that were deaf out of 164 delegates. One attendee was Ballastra, who was an advocate of the oral method and a representative of the Catholic Church. Ballastra spoke on behalf of God and salvation, and he argued the point that if a person could not speak, they could not pray, and therefore would be a sinner in the eyes of God. This struck most to agree, and they agreed that oral education was superior to manual education. They passed a resolution banning the use of sign language in schools. Robert McGregor was a deaf principal who was elected president of the National Convention of Deaf Mutes. He tried repeatedly to answer to the charge of Milan, however, was unable to create a positive change in the banning of sign language in schools. From the 1880s to 1960s, America was considered to be in the golden oral era in terms of education for the deaf because oral was strictly the method taught and practiced. In the 1960s, nobody thought that signing would ever replace oral methodologies. However, a gentleman named David Anthony had a large impact on that opinion. Anthony was a postlingually deaf man from England and an inventor of the system known as C1, or Seeing Essential English. His goal was to improve English literacy, and he believed that you could sign and speak simultaneously, but stressed that the individuals must have a strong grasp on English. He traveled around the United States performing workshops to teach his form of communication to anyone interested. The idea caught flame, and many people began using this form of communication to interact with other deaf individuals. Gerlie Guston was the head of education at Gallaudet University and an attendee of the workshops held by David Anthony. She felt that she could improve the language even further. Gustafson branched off and made C2, or Signing Exact English. She created the first sign book, which still is in production today. Many signs from C2 were the basis of American Sign Language, which is used for most frequently today. William Stokey was a hearing teacher at Gallaudet University in the mid-1960s. He never tried to learn how to sign to the students, as it was not allowed as an instructional method. What he found, however, was that children who had no instruction in signing were creating their own naturally occurring language with rules and syntax. He was the first to demonstrate that ASL existed and prove the rules. Many consider him to be the father of American Sign Language. As ASL began to prove more efficient and popular, many began to practice it as a language of instruction.
For many, many years, people didn't really pay attention to children with disabilities to begin with. And that was certainly true with deaf children who appear not to have a disability. When you see a deaf child, they appear to be totally intact. And so they weren't really on the radar. In the 1970s, when the federal government stepped in and said by law all children with disabilities required an education, most deaf children were being educated in what we call residential or center schools, where they boarded and lived away from home. Since that law passed, which is IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, those children have the right to go to their neighborhood schools. And so there is a fight now. Fight's perhaps not the right word. There's a fight between where children should go to school and who should pay for those children's schooling. So if a child from a local school district gets sent to a residential school like the Florida School for the Deaf and Blind, then the issue is who should pay for that, who gets to decide who goes to that school, and that continues to be a huge issue.
In 1975, the Public Law 94-142 was passed, allowing children with disabilities the legal right to go to school. This is now known as IDEA, or Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. The Zero Reject Act is the most powerful part of IDEA because it states that school or learning institutions cannot reject any child from education. In 1973, the VR Act Section 504 was the first federal statute that allowed deaf people non-discrimination. At this time in history, schools for the deaf were the first for children with disabilities and the first to have educational programs for the deaf.
Accountability has become very, very important. So one of the biggest struggles is trying to determine how to measure a child's growth when that child is deaf and has started at one school with one particular methodology, moved to another school with another methodology, moved to another school with another methodology. So the issue of accountability, the issue of communication is a huge struggle still in schools for the deaf. With the advent of cochlear implants, we're seeing more and more children needing or requesting oral environments for education, and having those environments exist in schools that are primarily sign language based schools is another struggle. Another, and perhaps the biggest struggle, is the struggle for survival in programs for the deaf. There is a move to decompartmentalize disabilities and treat all disabled children as though they have the same needs. And deaf children have very significant communication needs and linguistic needs that some other populations don't have. And so deaf children and their families are trying to preserve residential schools or segregated schools, whereas most children with disabilities and their families are fighting to abolish those kinds of schools. So there's a real tension between those populations.
What education options do deaf children have today? There are now many options for deaf education. Some of these include homeschooling, self-contained classrooms, mainstream schools, early intervention programs, oral day schools or signed day schools, and residential schools for the deaf. Because of laws such as IDEA and the VR Act Section 504, the deaf can receive the same opportunities as every child. The two most common schooling options are the residential schools and mainstream schools. There is much controversy over which is best for deaf children in terms of education.
With our school, it's just because we have so many different services that we're able to offer our students. I know a lot of our students come from smaller towns that just don't have the money in their school's programs to be able to provide different services, and we're able to do that here. Occupational therapy, physical therapy, audiology, speech therapy, and also having the classroom set up in a way that really focuses on, are geared towards deaf students instead of trying to adapt a hearing classroom to accommodate a deaf child. So I think that really is the most important thing. And then also just having that chance to socialize with their deaf friends. You know, here they're not only one.
Right.
We've actually had kids come here and we're shocked, like, oh, they're kids, deaf, same as me. I mean, I'm talking, we've had students before who had never seen another deaf kid. So it really, with the right situation, and I know it's not the right school for everyone. Now I'm honest about that. But when it's a good match with the student and the school, it really is just the best. Mostly just that they're so far removed from their families. And that, especially with the elementary students, is what we find is the hardest part, is just being separated from their families. You know, if we could, we'd have them all move here and we'd have everyone a day student, but that's just not possible, and we understand with families that that's not possible. So, I appreciate that the parents are able to make that decision, because I can assume that it's just the hardest decision they've got to make. So I can appreciate that, someone is sending me their child to take care of throughout the week. And, the huge responsibility that goes with that. But I would say that the only real negative is that they're so separated from their families.
I believe that one day there will probably be enough options available to allow deaf children to select the best option for them. I do not believe that those options will always be available. I think they will exist, but they won't be available because there is too much going on politically in education in general, fiscally in education in general, and unfortunately those two things very often take precedence over educational equality.